Well, kia ora GCC and Happy New Year. What do you think of when you think of God? How would you describe him? Veteran African-American pastor Tony Evans tells the story of an old man who was walking through a church building one day. And he looked into one of the children's classrooms, and there, sitting at a table all alone, was a little boy. Crayons around him, paper in front of him, furiously scribbling something on this piece of paper. And the old man went into the room and looked over, and he was drawing some kind of picture. And so the man asked the little boy, "What is it you're drawing?" The little boy's face was full of concentration, and he didn't even look up at this person talking to him. He just stayed focused on the paper, scribbling away. Crayon didn't stop. But he answered the question. He said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the old man smiled to himself. I heard a few snickers. The old man smiled to himself, and he said, "Oh, I didn't realize that people knew what God would look like." Again, the little boy didn't break concentration, didn't even look up, continued drawing. But again, he says, "Well, they're going to when I'm finished." What would you draw if you were going to draw a picture of God? What would end up on the page in front of you? Or if, like me, you're not an artist of any kind and you'd rather use words, what words would you choose? What adjectives would you pick out to describe the character of God? What phrases would you string together that would somehow adequately grab something of what God is like for you? In a sense, that's what this series is all about, that we're in and have been in for the last month or so. God has a name. And as we look at his name, Yahweh, and then look at some of the other names through these last number of weeks that God has given in the pages of Scripture, we're getting a glimpse. We're putting a portrait together of what this God is like. So just in the last few weeks, we've been thinking about the fact that God is holy. God is faithful. God is uncreated. He is our refuge. He is our shepherd. He is our warrior who fights for us. And today we're coming to another part of the Bible and looking at another description of God, but this one is just a little bit different. We're coming back to the book of Exodus, where Jonathan started this series back in mid-December. We were in Exodus chapter 3 then at the story of the burning bush. Now we're jumping about 30 chapters forward in the story into Exodus 34. And if you've got a Bible with you or a phone with an app and you want to follow along, you're welcome to do that. The words are going to come up on the screen here live. The words will come up on the screen for you too if you're online. But if you want to and want to have the words in front of you to follow along, you're welcome to do that. But this is a remarkable passage because all of the other passages that we've looked at, all of the other sections of the Bible, all of these other words or phrases that have described God that we've been looking at have come from the words of some of the writers of the Bible. People like David and Isaiah and Moses himself. We've read their words. We've looked at the portraits that they've been drawing of God for us. And they're beautiful portraits. They're true portraits. They're fully inspired by the Holy Spirit. But what makes this passage different in Exodus 34 is that this is not the words of Moses or David or Isaiah, although Moses is recording it. This is actually the words of God. This is what God is going to say about himself. It's as though God has gone up to the little boy and gently taken the crayon from him. And God is now doing a self-portrait. God's drawing the picture. And this is the way he describes himself in Exodus 34, verses 5 to 7. Then the Lord came down in the cloud, and he stood there with Moses and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. I would argue that this passage is one of the most important passages in the entire Hebrew Scriptures about the character of God. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that this is God's self-portrait. This is not just David describing God, although everything David says that it's inspired by the Spirit is true. It's not just Isaiah's thoughts or Moses' ideas. This is Yahweh. This is God himself taking the crayon and drawing the picture of himself. It makes it quite unique in all of Scripture. The second reason is that later scriptures in the Hebrew Bible will come back to this passage in Exodus 34 again and again and again. It's quoted verbatim 9 or 10 other times through the Bible by Joel and Nehemiah and Jonah, numerous times in the Psalms. And it's alluded to again and again through the Old Testament scriptures and the New Testament as well. It becomes one of the foundational passages in the whole Bible about God. Because this is his self-description. This is God taking the microphone. This is Yahweh picking up the crayon and sketching a picture of himself. So what I want to do with you for a few minutes today is I want to invite you to come with me and peer over the shoulder, not of a little boy, but of God Almighty, as he sketches his own self-portrait on the page. Let's look at how he describes himself. So he begins in verse 5. Then the Lord. Now I'm reading from the NIV, but the NIV follows every other English translation pretty much in taking God's name Yahweh and translating it Lord with capital letters. Only now on the words in front of you on the screen if you're online, or the words here in the auditorium, I'm now taking the Lord out and I'm putting in God's actual name, Yahweh, because that's what's in the text. And it becomes very important as we read the introduction to this amazing paragraph with his name in it. Then Yahweh came down in the cloud, and he stood there with Moses and proclaimed his name, Yahweh. Now, back at the beginning of the series, when Jonathan introduced us to the name of Yahweh, Jonathan explained that in the Old Testament, a person's name said something about who they were, their identity, their character, their attributes, something about them. So when Yahweh introduced himself in Exodus 3 with his name Yahweh, he was telling Moses something about his character. Now in Exodus 34, he's coming to Moses again, and he is again proclaiming his name Yahweh. So he's about to tell Moses something even more specific about himself. Verse 6 says, and then he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, Yahweh, Yahweh. Now that kind of seems a little redundant, isn't it, to say your name? Hi, my name's Brad. Kind of seems a bit weird. But in the Hebrew language, the way they emphasized something was by way of repetition. And the way they tried to say that something was the most or the greatest was by repeating it. So you might be familiar with the phrase from the Bible, King of Kings. That's the way the Hebrew language is trying to say the greatest king. So they repeat it, the King of Kings. In the book of Exodus, they're going to build a worship tent for God called a tabernacle. And right at the very center of that tent is a place that they're called the Holy of Holies, which meant the most holy place. That's the way our English translations will translate it. And so in Hebrew, if you want to emphasize the greatest or the most, you say King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Holy of Holies. Now come back to verse 6. Yahweh of Yahweh. In other words, what I think Yahweh is saying here is, this is the most of me you're ever going to see. Moses, I'm about to crack open my robes and open myself up and let you look into the very core of who I am. This is who I am. This is me at the very heart of my being, Moses. Do you know what I am like? Yahweh, at my core. Look at the next line. Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God. Yahweh says, this is who I am. At the very core of my being, when you crack it all open and get to my very heart, do you know what I'm really like at my heart of hearts? I am compassionate and gracious. And those two words go together. It's not that Yahweh's giving two attributes, it's one attribute. I am compassionately gracious. I am graciously compassionate. And those two words go together to make a single concept. And they work powerfully together. That first word there, compassionate, the original Hebrew word, it's a feeling word. Yahweh's describing his feelings for his people. In fact, it comes in the Hebrew language, the root word is the word that is used to describe the womb of a woman and the emotions that a mother feels for a baby that she carries in her womb. And Yahweh is saying, that's the feelings I have for my people. I love them with an overwhelming affection and compassion and a deep feeling of love. And then that's combined with the second word, gracious, which in the Hebrew language is an action word. So Yahweh is saying, I feel love, but I also act lovingly. And so I step out and I do things for the people that I love. And the essence of this word, grace, is that it's undeserved. In other words, Yahweh says, I feel a deep love for people and I act on their behalf even when they don't deserve it. Even when they've had a bad day, even when they can't earn it, and will never ever be able to repay me, I love and I act and I feel. I am Yahweh, the God of compassionate grace. And that's the key idea of this passage and the key facet that Yahweh wants to understand. As he takes the crayon off the little boy and sketches a portrait for us, this is what he's saying. At my core, I am the God of grace. At his core, Yahweh is the God of grace. And I'm going to say that phrase again and again and again through this message. At his core, Yahweh is a God of grace. Now, what's fascinating is that Moses asked to see something very special. This whole revelation of who God is, this self-portrait that Yahweh draws, is in response to a request that Moses makes in the previous chapter. Moses and Yahweh have been having a conversation and a dialogue, and it comes to an end in the middle of Exodus 33, and here's what Moses then says. Moses said, "Now show me your glory." Moses, at the end of this conversation, says, Yahweh, I want to see have a deeper revelation of who you are. Would you show me your glory? And Yahweh responds in verse 19, I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, Yahweh, in your presence. Now, my hunch is that what Moses was after was another demonstration or revelation of the power of God. Moses is right now standing on the top of Mount Sinai. And back in chapter 19 of Exodus, when Yahweh first comes onto Sinai with the whole nation at the foot of the mountain, he comes with lightning and smoke and fire and demonstrations of his power. And I think that's what Moses is after. Moses is wanting a fresh sense of the power and the majesty and the might and awesomeness of Yahweh. See, for you and I and Moses, the glory of God is seen in his greatness. That's the equation. Glory equals greatness. But look again at verse 19, if we can bring those back up on the screen again. Look at what Yahweh says. I will cause all of my goodness to pass in front of you. See, we think of the glory of God as his majestic power at work. We think that's what makes God awesome. What Yahweh says is no, glory is not seen in my greatness. Glory is seen in my goodness. You get to the heart of who I am as an awesome being. What you find is not great power. What you find is grace. What you find is a heart of love that chooses to act on behalf of the people that I care about. See, at his core, Yahweh is the God of grace. And then what happens in Exodus 34 is he strings 4 more statements, one after another, to further describe who he is and what he is doing. And what we need to understand, this is not 5 descriptions of Yahweh. This is actually one description of Yahweh with a whole bunch of more things over and around it. So Yahweh here says, I am the compassionate and gracious God. And then he strings 4 more statements after it. And it's not that he's giving 5 attributes, he's giving 1 attribute. That he is compassionately gracious. And then he's putting these 4 other statements around it to help us understand more deeply his grace. So if you imagine, it's kind of like a sunflower with this beautiful big center. And in the center of the flower, Yahweh has written, I am the gracious and compassionate God. And then these next 4 statements are like these 4 gigantic petals that come out of the center and help us understand the beauty of God's grace in all of its fullness. So petal number 1 then follows. Yahweh, Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger. Slow to anger. This means that Yahweh is the God of patient grace. Part of him being a God of grace is that he is patient with people. This doesn't mean that God never gets angry. He does, and he does judge sin, but he's a patient God. He doesn't have a short fuse. He doesn't erupt in a rage of anger. When God is forced to judge, he waits a long time before he brings that. Because he is a lovingly patient God. It's part of what his grace is. Love the statement I read just lately by an author called Dane Ortland. He says, this is why the Old Testament speaks of God being provoked to anger by his people. Not once are we told that God is provoked to love or provoked to mercy. His anger requires provocation. His mercy, however, his grace is pent up, ready to gush forth. I love that idea. God has to be provoked to be angry, and it takes him a long time to get to that point. But God is this God of grace who wants to bless people and act in love towards people even though they don't deserve it. The second petal then is found in the next statement. He is the compassionate and gracious God. It says slow to anger. Secondly, abounding in love and faithfulness. Paul talked about the faithfulness of God last week, and this is what's being highlighted here. And again, this is not 2 ideas, it's 2 statements that go together. He is abounding or overflowing in loving faithfulness or faithful love. So God is faithful, which Paul rightly said last week, means he keeps his promises. And that's because he's the God here of love. Now, this word is one of the most important words in the Old Testament in the Hebrew language. It's the Hebrew word hesed, H-E-S-E-D. But in the Hebrew language, it's got this ch at the front of it. It's like a CH sound. Chesed. You got to get a big hoik sound behind it. You want to try it? Say it with me. Say it even online. Chesed. Yeah, no, more hoik. You need more hoik than that. Chesed. This, scholars say, chesed is the most important quality of God in the Old Testament scriptures. It is emphasized again and again and again. And we translate it love, but love by itself almost isn't enough to capture the beauty of this word. And so scholars will try and define it loyal love, or unfailing love, or love that never lets us go. And that's why God's faithful. That's why God keeps his promises, because he's the God of chesed. He never, ever lets us go. And so Yahweh, as he takes the crayon and he draws this picture, is saying, I am the God of compassionate grace, and that means I'm a patient God. But it also means that Yahweh is the God of faithful grace. He always comes through. He always says what he does what he said he'd do, and he never lets us go. And then the third petal comes at the beginning of verse 7. Maintaining love to thousands. What's the word? It's love. It's the same word again. Chesed. It's the only repetition apart from God's name, Yahweh. But this time it's a different emphasis. Now it's not his faithfulness or loyalty being stressed. Now he says, I maintain my chesed, unfailing love for thousands of people. And it never runs dry. We've gone through this water shortage in Auckland, haven't we? Where we've had to stop putting the sprinkler on and stop washing the car for a number of months, although you can do that now. Mine's outside. If you want to just go help me out, that would be great. But we've had these reservoirs in Auckland that have been empty, or not empty, but very low to a danger level, so we've had to conserve water. What Yahweh is saying is my grace never runs low. There's never a shortage. It doesn't matter how many people tap into my grace, it'll never run out. It never even drops slightly. I am the God who pours out and lavishes my grace on every person who comes to me. Yahweh is the God of patient grace and faithful grace and limitless grace. And then the fourth pedal, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. These are three separate words in the original language that define sin slightly differently, but when they get clumped together like this, it's trying to say all sin, every sin. Yahweh is ready to forgive everything that we've done, all kinds of categories, every mistake we've ever made, every time we've hurt someone intentionally or unintentionally, he forgives the lot. Because Yahweh is a God of forgiving grace. And that's so important in the context of this story. See, just a couple of chapters earlier, the people of Israel had bowed down to a statue of a golden bull. Yahweh had brought them out of slavery in Egypt, made a beautiful covenant or treaty with them. And then no sooner has Moses headed up the mountain, but days later they are involved in this gross orgy of worship to an idol. Every man, woman, and child in Israel involved. And so Yahweh comes here and he reveals himself as this patient, limitless, faithful, forgiving God of grace in the very context of human wickedness and sin. Because he longs to forgive. He loves to forgive. Some of you need to hear that today. Some of you believe that you've gone too far to ever be forgiven by God. Some of you think that you've failed one time too often. Some of you think that you would never be welcome by this kind of God, and you're wrong. Because Yahweh, as he draws this picture of himself, is trying to help us understand. He is this God of forgiving grace. No matter what we've done, no matter how we've failed, no matter how many times we've messed it up and made a mess of our lives, Yahweh invites us to come to him. Because this is who he is at his core, the God of incredible grace. At his core, Yahweh is the God of grace, patient grace, limitless grace, forgiving grace, faithful grace. But we haven't quite exhausted the passage. Because there's this annoying little piece at the end that if you've ever read it, you may wish actually wasn't there. Because the second half of verse 7 reads this way. He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation. What is going on with that? I called my parents this morning just to make sure that they had a good week and hadn't done anything too drastic or sinful. That's how it reads, isn't it? That's actually not what Yahweh is saying. Yahweh isn't trying to say that, oh, good night, parents and grandparents need to behave or their kids and grandkids are going to get smoked. That's not what he's saying. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, Yahweh will say exactly the opposite. He says, you don't judge the children for the sin of the parents. You don't take out on the grandchildren the sin of the grandparents. So what's going on? What Yahweh is doing here is a qualification to everything he said. This last bit, this is not a fifth petal on the flower. It's the center with 4 petals. And then this phrase at the end is a caveat. It's a qualification. It's kind of like the stalk of the flower that anchors the flower in the soil of reality, of a sinful world, of fallen people. And what Yahweh is trying to say is, I am this God of incredible grace, but don't take that grace for granted. And don't assume that because I'm this patient God, forgiving God, faithful God, this God of grace, that means anyone can do anything and I'm just going to wink at it. This is not a general amnesty for all people. This is not a everyone gets a ticket to heaven. Yahweh is saying, I am a God of grace, but there comes a time when I do judge sin and take it seriously. And what he's saying specifically in this passage is that sometimes when he comes to have to judge sin after being so patient, sometimes he has to judge sin, and even the children and the grandchildren and later generations feel the consequences of that sin. So later on in the Old Testament, in the book of Judges, he will allow people to conquer the nation of Israel. Later in the story, he will allow his people to go into exile in Babylon and Assyria. And it's the children and grandchildren that reap the consequences of their parents' and grandparents' sin. And so Yahweh is saying, this is who I am. The God of compassionate grace, patient, forgiving, faithful, limitless. But don't assume that means there's a general amnesty for all people, because one day I do judge sin, and I will. And what that means is that if we want this Yahweh to be like this to us, if we want to experience his grace and his forgiveness, we can't just assume, well, he's a gracious God, I'll be fine. We have to come to him and bring our mess and bring our sin and bring all the stuff-ups we've made and come to him and trust him to be this God. This is the picture that Yahweh draws. He takes the crayon out of the little boy's hand and he sketches a self-portrait for us. This is what he draws. This is who Yahweh is. At his core, Yahweh is the God of grace. Patient, faithful, limitless, forgiving grace. But here's our problem. Most of us don't hear these words. Most of us struggle to actually recognize the picture that Yahweh's drawn. Most of us find it very hard to hear these words and fully comprehend them and take them in. Because Yahweh says, I am the compassionate and gracious God. And you know what some of us hear? What we hear is, I am the angry and frustrated God. That's the way some of us view God, isn't it? He says compassionate, gracious. We hear angry and frustrated. And we have the sense that God is annoyed with us and angry at us and always rolling his eyebrows at the mess-ups we make in our lives. That's how some of us view God, isn't it? God says, I am the gracious and compassionate God. And some of us hear, I am the harsh and stringent God. I'm the God who wants to kill all your joy and fun. I'm the God who brings in all these bunches of rules and do's and don'ts because I'm out to ruin your life. That's how some of us hear him speak. He says, I'm the gracious and compassionate God, and some of us hear, I'm annoyed and disappointed. I'm not angry, just disappointed. That's how many of us, in our heart of hearts, that's how many of us think God really feels about us, isn't it? He says, I am gracious and compassionate. For some of us in hard circumstances right now, what we hear him say is, I am distant and uncaring. I'm off on holiday. I'm enjoying my summer. I'll leave you to your pain and hardship and suffering. And our problem is that because we are fallen people, we don't see the picture he's drawing. We don't hear the words that he's saying. And he's trying to help us see he's a God of grace. He's trying to say to us over and over again, I am the God who is gracious and compassionate and patient and faithful and forgiving, and we don't hear it. In our heart of hearts, we just can't bring ourselves to believe this is really true of who he is. Quoted earlier from this author called Dan Ortland. I've been reading a book this summer called Gentle and Lowly, on the character of Jesus. He writes these words: the fall in Genesis 3, when sin enters our world, the fall not only sent us into condemnation and exile from God, the fall also entrenched in our minds dark thoughts of God. Thoughts that can only be dug out over multiple exposures to the gospel, the good news, over many years. The Christian life, then, from one angle, he says, is a long journey of letting our natural assumption about who God is over many decades fall away, being slowly replaced with God's own insistence of who he is. And this is hard work. See, I would argue that every one of us sitting in the auditorium today, we walked through those doors carrying a picture of God in our minds. Those of you watching online, when you jumped online today, you brought with you a picture of what you think God is like. And what Dane Ortland is saying is every one of us, the picture that we have of God is somewhat flawed and somewhat dark and somewhat smudged because of our sin and our fallen nature. Some of us have a better picture of God than others, but none of our pictures are perfectly right. And what Yahweh is inviting us to do over the pilgrimage of life is to keep coming back to his words and keep coming back to his picture and slowly erase and change our picture until it becomes the true picture of what Yahweh really is like. And that's the invitation to us, little by little, year by year, to erase what's wrong in our understanding of God and replace it with the beauty of his self-description and self-portrait. See, at his very core, in his heart of hearts, Yahweh is the God of patient, forgiving, limitless, compassionate, faithful grace. And if that's true, folks, it's no surprise that he becomes one of us, is it? It's no surprise that Jesus walks into the story. Because if at his core God is a God of grace, he cannot leave us in our sin. He has to step in. He has to come and be part of the story. He has to come and save and find a way to forgive people who don't deserve it, but who he loves anyway because he's a God of grace. So it's no wonder Jesus walks into the stage. If God is a God of grace, it's no wonder Jesus would say what he says and do what he does. And if God is a God of grace, it's no wonder Jesus will go to the cross to pay the ultimate price so that Yahweh can be the faithful, forgiving, patient, gracious God that he has always been. The band is going to join me up here on stage, and they're going to lead us today in a worship response. And we're going to take communion together. We have tables of bread and juice ready to respond in the way that Jesus invited us to do. And if you're watching online, you're welcome to pause this or slip out and grab a bread roll and a can of Coke or whatever will work for you to join us in communion. Here's what I want to invite you to do, though, whether you're online, whether you're here physically this morning. As you come to take the elements, as you come to the table, I want to invite you, in a sense, to bring with you the flawed picture of God that you walked in with. And in a sense, mentally, I want to invite you just to lay your picture down on the communion table. Maybe even better, to put it in the rubbish bin that's next to the table. And then as you pick up bread and pick up juice, emblems of the body of Yahweh in the flesh, I want to invite you mentally to pick up this portrait that God has drawn for you today. The God who at his core is the God of incredible grace. Yahweh, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Because that, at its core, is who Yahweh is.